Welcome to our webinar this evening at Magdalen. And I'm really happy to see so many of you here on our screen. And with us this evening, we have Professor Simon Horobin, a tutor and fellow of Magdalen in English language and literature. And Simon has been a fellow at Magdalen since 2006 and is the author of a number of books on the English language, including Does Spelling Matter? How English Became English, The English Language, A Very Short Introduction, and his latest book, Bagels, Bumf, and Buses, A Day in the Life of the English Language. And Simon is here tonight to talk to us on that topic. And I'm going to hand over to him. Thank you very, very much, Simon.
Thanks, Dinah. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Hopefully you can all see that okay. Good. So there are, of course, many books about the origins of English words and phrases, but these tend to focus on unusual idioms and sayings. Who was the real McCoy? Why was Larry so happy? And how did a cat come to die of curiosity? I deal with some of these in the book, but here I'm more interested in words that we use all the time, looking at where they came from, how their uses have evolved over the centuries, and why some have fallen out of use while others have stayed with us. And the book is structured around a typical day, hence the subtitle, A Day in the Life of the English Language. It begins with the sounding of the alarm, from the Italian allarme, to arms, originally a distress call issued to alert an army to an oncoming attack. And then it examines words that we use to describe everyday activities. And that's why bagels, bumf, and buses. So the bagel that you eat for breakfast, which goes back to a word for an arm ring worn by Germanic warriors. Or the bumf that you wade through at the office, a contraction of bum fodder, originally used of toilet paper and then transferred to any worthless material on paper. And the bus that you ride to and from the office, a clipped form of Latin omnibus for all, a term adopted by a French transport company to distinguish it from more expensive and so more exclusive competitors. Having been published way back in 2019, it's obviously already woefully out of date, since it covers activities like going to the theatre, playing sport and eating out, and makes no mention at all of hand sanitizer. What I thought I'd do today is talk about the process of researching the book. How do we go about tracing the origins of words and the various ways in which new words come into existence? The study of word origins is known as etymology. It originates in the Greek word etymos, meaning true, reflecting the way that the ancient Greeks believed that a word's earliest form reflected its authentic meaning. And there are still those today who insist that the correct meaning of English words may be determined by reference to their origins, and who claim, for instance, that decimate can only mean reduce by a tenth, since it's from Latin decimus, tenth. But if we were to follow such an approach, December should be the 10th month, as it was in the Roman calendar before January and February were added. And if we did insist on only sanctioning the use of decimate in its original sense, that is, put to death 1 in every 10 of an army of mutinous soldiers, how often would we really use it? The study of etymology has a long history, although its earlier practitioners were sometimes led astray by superficial similarities between words. So Dr. Johnson, in his having some problems making my slides move. Hang on one second. Dr. Johnson, in his Dictionary of the English Language, published in 1755, considered the etymology of the word spider, and he hypothesized with the rather fanciful suggestion, may not spider be spy door, the insect that watches the door? Well, the answer is, of course, no, it may not. Instead of looking for connections between contemporary forms of words, etymologists begin with the earliest recorded instances. So if we go back to Old English, we can see that the form of spider in Old English was in fact spithra, a word which we can then derive from the verb spinan, to spin, revealing how the name draws on the insect's web spinning capabilities, rather than a tendency to construct its webs on doorways. But not all Dr. Johnson's etymologies were so obviously misguided. Let's take another example, the word bonfire, which he derived from the French adjective bon, good. Now, given the large number of French words that were borrowed into the English language, this seems an entirely plausible connection. But the editors of the new English Dictionary, what became the Oxford English Dictionary in the 19th century, came up with a quotation in a text written in 1450, which rather disproved his theory. It says, "In the worship of St. John, men waketh at home and maketh 3 manner fires. One is cleaner, purely bones, and no wood, and is called a bonfire," or originally bone fire. Now, this is the earliest recorded use of the word bonfire, and it makes it clear that the term was used to refer to a fire in which bones were burnt as part of the celebrations for midsummer. Now, we can see from this how later changes to the word's spelling, pronunciation, and meaning can obscure its origins. So here, the long vowel sound in bone has been shortened in this compound, which make it look and sound more like the French word bon, but the similarity is entirely serendipitous. All of this serves to highlight the importance of documentation to etymologists. And W. Skeat, who was one of the founding fathers of etymology, who wrote the Etymological Dictionary of the English Language at the end of the 19th century, warned that to attempt to etymologize without the help of quotations is like learning geology without inspecting specimens. But even when gifted such apparently solid evidence, etymologists must remain skeptical. So the editors of the ongoing 3rd edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, now on the web at oed.com, add a note of caution to the etymology of bonfire that I just quoted, suggesting that the explanation offered in the quotation may reflect the influence of folk etymology. That's to say that because some bonfires involve the burning of bones, the writer assumed that that must be the origin of the word. So folk etymology is a term used to describe popular theories about the origins of words, which are generally based on little evidence and on circumstantial and superficial connections. It reflects a natural inclination for speakers to look for patterns between words that appear to be connected, and it may even trigger changes to the words themselves. So here's an example. This, as I'm sure you are aware, is a crayfish. But have you ever wondered why it's called a crayfish, but it isn't actually a fish? It's a crustacean. Well, the reason is that it goes back to a borrowing of the old French word crevice. And when this word was borrowed into English, speakers adopted and adapted the word to the similar sounding word fish, crevice, crayfish, reflecting this basic presumption that animals that live in water must be types of fish, even when it doesn't look like one. As well as leading to changes in their form, attempts to anglicize foreign words have prompted the emergence of entirely new ones. So the asparagus gets its name from the Greek word asparagos, but it came into English via a medieval Latin form, sparagus. And this was subsequently anglicised into another more recognisable English form, sparrowgrass. And that was the preferred form throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. So I've given you an example there of Samuel Pepys recording in his diary, buying 100 of sparrowgrass. But by the 19th century, it had become a marker of low class and illiteracy. Here's an example from the old curiosity shop, where it's being used by the landlord of the public house, indicating its slipping standards. And as a response to this shift in status, the more learned borrowing, which was taken direct from the Greek asparagos, was introduced into English. Folk etymology is most apparent today in the widespread belief that many words originated as acronyms. Now, a number of words did originate this way. So radar, for instance, is in origin an acronym, radio detection and ranging. But it's by no means as widespread a process as is often claimed. Despite this, many words are popularly thought to have been coined using this method, giving birth to numerous plausible yet unhistorical acronyms, and these are what are known as bacronyms. Perhaps the most long-lived instance of this is the theory that POSH originated as an acronym, standing for port, outward, and starboard, home. A supposed reference to the way that tickets of the wealthiest passengers on liners travelling between England and India were supposedly stamped with the letters P-O-S-H, indicating that they were to be allocated the more desirable shady cabins on the port side on the outward journey and on the starboard side on the return journey. So it's an attractive story, but the problem with it is that there's no evidence of any such tickets ever having been issued. It's another problem of documentation. Nice story, but no evidence. The true origins of the word posh remain unclear. They may lie in a 19th century slang word for a coin or a term for a dandy, or neither, resulting in the rather disappointing yet honest etymology that we often find ourselves falling back on, that is, origin unknown. This example reminds us that tracing the histories of words doesn't always result in a clear-cut answer. In the words of Anatoly Lieberman, words are not characters in a Conan Doyle or an Agatha Christie story and are not in a hurry to confess even on the last page. Now, it may seem from what I've been saying that etymologists spend much of their time pouring cold water on lively and engaging word histories, replacing them with alternatives that are considerably more mundane. But while the etymological truth may at times appear more pedestrian than the imaginative alternatives, many common English words conceal poetic images that are revealed by a study of their etymology. So a daisy was originally Old English deus eaga, which means day's eye, a name that was coined to reflect the way that the flower closes its petals overnight and reopens them at first light. No one knows who was the first person to observe this phenomenon and to coin the word, but it stuck and remains in use more than 1,000 years after it was first written down. Returning to the spider with which I began. The word cobweb was originally copweb, which preserves the link to another Old English word for this insect, the attercop, or literally a poison head, reflecting the popular belief at the time that spiders were venomous, and showing us how words can preserve evidence of folk beliefs and practices even after those connections have been forgotten. The word attercop is best known today from its appearance in Tolkien's fantasy novel The Hobbit, where it features in a song that Bilbo Baggins employs to distract the spiders while attempting to save Thorin and his companions. Old fat spider spinning in a tree, old fat spider can't see me, Attercop, won't you stop? Stop your spinning and look for me. Now, as Professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford, Tolkien is of course something of a special case when it comes to the revival of Old English words. Another example is the word orc, from an Old English word meaning demon or evil spirit, a word which Tolkien used in The Hobbit. Initially, the slopes of the Grey Mountains are simply stiff with goblins, hobgoblins, and orcs of the worst description. And he says that the reason he used it was he particularly liked the way it sounded, its phonetic suitability. In Old English, the word orc is best known in the compound orkneas, in the epic poem Beowulf, where you can see it here, keeping company with some other beasts that populate Tolkien's Middle-earth, Eotanas, giants, and Ulvar, elves. These same beasts appear amongst the motley crew that support the White Witch in C.S. Lewis's novel, Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, in this passage. Such people, ogres with monstrous teeth and wolves and bull-headed men, spirits of evil trees and poisonous plants, and other creatures whom I won't describe because if I did, the grown-ups would probably not let you read this book. Cruels and hags and incubuses, wraiths, horrors, ifrits, sprites, orkneys, there's that word from Beowulf, woozes, and etins, that's Old English Eotan, giant. So here we have the same creatures from Beowulf alongside some new ones, the woozes, Old English wudu-waza, a wild man of the woods, and efrit, an Arabic term for a demon, familiar to Lewis from his reading of the Tales of the Arabian Nights. I do an outreach session for primary school children at Magdalen in which I talk to them about C.S. Lewis, and I use the Narnia books as a way into medieval literature. And when I started doing this, I helpfully explained to the kids, who were all about 7 or 8, what the origins of the efrits and orkneys and woozes and etins are. But I quickly discovered that as I described the Walking Dead, evil spirits, demons, and devils, that the looks on the teachers' faces made me realize that Lewis was perhaps right not to go into detail here, for fear that grown-ups would not allow children to read this book. But Tolkien and Lewis aren't actually the only authors who engage in this practice. Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials, currently being televised by the BBC in the 2nd series, is currently shown, you may be watching it, depicts a world which he describes as like ours, but different in many ways. And this was particularly true, I think, for those of us in the Magdalen community in the most recent episode in which the college itself made an appearance. One way that Pullman achieves this eerie blend of similarity and strangeness is through his use of language. The word demon, describing an animal embodiment of a human soul, is pronounced identically with the English demon, but has this distinctive spelling in the books, with this AE ligature reflecting the Latin form, intended to invoke the older sense of attendant spirit. In the first episode of the 2nd series, Lyra and Will, who come from different worlds, discover that they have alternative words for electricity. So in Lyra's world, lights are fueled by anbaric rather than electric energy. And anbaric comes from the Arabic word for amber. It's particularly appropriate here since the same root lies behind the word electric, which is from the Latin word for amber, electrum. And the reason for this is that electric was originally used to describe objects that develop static electricity when rubbed, a property first observed in amber. As well as reviving extinct words, authors also invent their own, which makes the job of the etymologist considerably easier. Take the word serendipity that I used earlier. This word for an event that occurs by happy chance in a beneficial way was the invention of Horace Walpole in a letter of 1754. We know this because, writing to a friend, he says, "This discovery is almost of that kind which I call serendipity." And helpfully, he goes on to explain that the word is based upon the title of a fairy tale named The Three Princes of Serendip, which is the former name of what is now Sri Lanka. The reason for this is that the three princes in the story are going around making accidental discoveries of things that they were not actually looking for, hence serendipity. Other authorisms, as these kinds of words are known, are the work of great literary writers. So Shakespeare is credited with a host of them, from assassination to zany. And others include John Milton's pandemonium, the term for the capital of hell in Paradise Lost, which literally means all the devils. But it's not just great literary writers who coin terms that go on to be widely used. The word blurb, a short promotional description of a book, originates in the work of the American writer Gelett Burgess, who featured a fictitious young woman called Miss Belinda Blurb on the cover of one of his comic books in 1907. So here she is in the act of blurbing. Nor is it clear why some authorisms catch on while others don't. Virginia Woolf was clearly very proud of her coinage, scrolloping, a blend of scroll and lollop, but nobody but her ever seems to have used it, according to this entry in the OED. The word nerd originates in a wacky humanoid character invented by children's author Dr. Seuss in his book, If I Ran the Zoo. But this doesn't explain why this word is still used today to describe geeky obsessives, and not any of these other words, preep or prue or nurgle. Today, the rise of technologies and social media is creating a huge need for new terms, which can then be spread across the world much more quickly than ever before. This means that the word's origins are much easier to trace, since there's often an electronic record that can be searched for the first tested use, while the word's subsequent development and spread can easily be monitored. So the word selfie can be traced back to its apparent first use in 2002, when an Australian man posted an image of his injured face, having fallen down some steps, having drunk heavily at a friend's 21st birthday party. In the post, he apologized for the poor quality of the picture, which he said should not be attributed to drunkenness, but rather to its being a selfie. And the term spam, used of the junk email offering us lucrative business deals in exchange for our bank details, takes us back to the bulletin boards populated by early computer enthusiasts. The term is derived from the name of the tinned luncheon meat, whose name is a blend of spiced ham. And the curious connection between the luncheon meat and the unwanted email can be explained by reference to a Monty Python sketch set in a cafe in which spam forms the principal ingredient of every dish on the menu. And so, like the junk messages that flood our inboxes, cannot be avoided. Despite being a recent invention, the wireless communication technology Bluetooth takes us back to medieval Scandinavia. The term originates in the epithet given to King Harald I of Denmark, who united a collection of Scandinavian territories under Danish rule in the 10th century. This process of unification was thought to be similar to the way in which Bluetooth technology enables communication between different electronic devices, And the Bluetooth symbol itself also draws upon this ancient Scandinavian connection, since it comprises the two runic symbols that make up King Harold's initials. The potential of social media for spreading neologisms that capture a new concept for which there was no equivalent term was harnessed by a group of lexicographers and PR executives who set out somewhat cynically to coin a word that would go on to be adopted throughout the English-speaking world as a marketing stunt. The word they came up with was phubbing. So I wonder how many of you are familiar with that term, how successful this attempt to coin a word and get everybody to use it really was. If you're wondering what it means, I can give you a clue, because here's a picture of it in action. So the word is a blend of phone and snubbing. And it's used to describe that rather well-known sight of two people sitting together in a restaurant or a cafe, and they're deep in conversation, but they're on their mobile phones rather than speaking to each other. They are phone snubbing or phubbing. So I suspect not many people have heard of or used that word. Despite capturing a recognized concept, the coinage and its success was rather let down by its lack of euphony. It doesn't sound like a very nice word, and therefore it hasn't really caught on. This method of word formation, blending two words together in this way, is best known from the works of Lewis Carroll, especially his poem Jabberwocky, which introduced readers to slithy, a blend of slimy and lithe, to chortle, chuckle and snort, and galumphing, gallop and triumph. In the preface to The Hunting of the Snark, Carroll explained that frumious is created when you intend to say fuming and furious, but you don't decide which one to say first. In Through the Looking Glass, Humpty Dumpty likens words formed by blending to a portmanteau suitcase, with two meanings packed up into one word. This term was then taken up by etymologists, and portmanteau has since become a standard way of describing words formed in this manner, as in this quote from the Transactions of the Philological Society, long after the portmanteau suitcase itself has fallen out of use. Although it's often thought to be a recent phenomenon, blending has in fact been a productive method of forming new English words for some time. The name given to the late morning meal that combines breakfast and lunch, brunch, which seems perhaps to be a kind of 1990s phenomenon, goes back to Oxford's slang of the 1890s. And there are examples of this method of word formation going back to the Middle Ages. But along with these deliberate coinages are a number of words that are simply the result of errors, albeit ones which are now acceptable parts of standard English. People often say to me, they don't mind language changing as long as it's not just people getting it wrong. But unfortunately, that is often exactly what it is. Though, of course, it's only our artificial concept of a standard language that considers these to be errors rather than variant forms. So I'll give you an example. The phrase stark naked was originally start naked, from the Old English steord, meaning a tail. So the phrase literally meant naked to the tail, probably referring to the backside, as in the American phrase work your tail off. The word steord fell out of general use in English around 1300, and it survives today only in the name of the redstart, a bird with a red tail. The switch from start to stark naked was triggered partly by the word stark becoming obsolete, combined with an association with stark, meaning completely, in phrases like stark dead and stark blind. Another example of a word that has been formed by people getting it wrong is the word sneeze. Self-evidently, perhaps, this is one of a number of words that are imitative in origin. That's to say, the sound of the word imitates the sound of the thing it names, as with words like drip, fizz, beep, and the noise created by the sneeze itself, a tissue. But the original form of the word sneeze was in fact fneeze. The change from fneeze to sneeze came about through confusion caused by the way the word appeared in medieval manuscripts. So in medieval handwriting, there were a number of different ways of writing the letter S, and I've highlighted some of them here. There's an H-shaped form, there's one that looks rather like a kidney bean, there's the Greek sigma, and then there's the long form, long S, which closely resembles the letter F. And this long S remained in use in English for several centuries, right until the 18th century in print. And it was confusion between the long S and F that ultimately resulted in fneeze becoming adapted to modern English sneeze. Another way in which speakers get things wrong is known as meta-analysis, whereby speakers mishear the boundary between two connected words. An example of this is the word adder, which goes back to an Old English word, nadra. It's one of a small number of English words where the initial N has been lost as a result of confusion over where the boundary falls when following the indefinite article a. So as a result, a nadra became an adder. The same misapprehension lies behind words like apron from napron and umpire from numpire originally, going back to non-peer, no equal. The word cherry originates in the northern French dialect word cherise, which is a Norman dialect variant of the standard modern French word cerise, adapted into English after the Norman conquest in 1066. Because it ends in an S, English speakers mistakenly understood it to be a plural form, and so the false singular form cherry was born. And the same process lies behind the word pea, which is erroneously derived from the form peas, which was understood to be a plural, but it was in fact a singular, going ultimately back to Greek pison. That's still preserved in the nursery rhyme, peas pudding hot, peas pudding cold. Although these changes took place hundreds of years ago, so the question of correctness may now seem irrelevant, but the process is still at work today. An example of this is the emergence of a false singular bicep, a singular form of biceps. It might seem like a logical development, but in fact biceps itself is an adoption of a singular Latin noun from bi, to, and ceps, headed, referring to a muscle with 2 points of attachment. The tendency for speakers to associate the S ending with plurals has given birth to new plural forms as well, especially in nouns derived from languages where plurals are formed in other ways. So despite phenomena being the plural form of Greek phenomenon, it's now common to hear the false plural phenomenas. But the error of this type, most likely to make pedants reach for their red pens, is of course paninis, the supposed plural of the Italian panini, singular panino. Researching this book didn't just involve visiting cafes to check for solecisms like paninis or espresso instead of espresso, and counting the numbers of P's and C's in cappuccino. Much of my time was spent reading dictionaries and thesauruses, from a Greek word meaning storehouse, and the origin of the English word treasure which I think nicely captures the true value of such works. I've also plundered a diverse range of historical sources. Particularly fruitful is the diary of the Londoner Samuel Pepys, who gives us the first recorded use of the word tea, a China drink of which I had never drunk before, in 1660. As Pepys suggests, tea is derived from the Chinese dialect form te, ultimately from a Mandarin word cha, which is where we get our nice cup of cha. And Pepys also records the invention of the vest in an entry in October 1666. He says, "The king hath yesterday in council declared his resolution of setting a fashion for clothes. It will be a vest. I know not well how, but it is to teach the nobility thrift." Now, this is probably not the garment that you were picturing. When Charles II appeared wearing the vest a week later, it was described by Pepys as a long cassock close to the body of black cloth and pinked with white silk under it, and a coat over it, and the legs ruffled with black ribbon like a pigeon's leg. Now, this may not sound like an obvious way of promoting economy, but the idea was that by wearing more clothing, Londoners would cut down on their heating bills. And this garment may show something of a resurgence over Christmas if we are forced to eat our turkeys outside. Despite its name, this long cassock is not the origin of the modern vest, but what is now termed a waistcoat, originally pronounced waistcoat. The modern pronunciation has been influenced by the spelling, and still, of course, called a vest in North America. Pepys also preserves instances of early spellings like jocolat for chocolate, when he first goes to a coffee house to drink chocolate, very good, and of alternative pronunciations like cowcumber, which he records in his diaries, the demise of Mr. Newburn, who apparently died from eating cowcumbers. This pronunciation was still in use in the 19th century, when it became a marker of illiteracy and low class, as seen by its use by Mrs. Gamp here in Dickens's novel, Martin Chuzzlewit. In case there should be such a thing as a cowcumber in the house, will you be so kind as to bring it, for I'm rather partial to 'em, and they does a world of good in a sick room. She was clearly unaware of the fate of poor Mr. Newburn. Now, you might be thinking that this is all old news, since words are so last millennium and set to be replaced by the universal language of the smiling face, otherwise known as emoji. Indeed, it's possible that the increasing development and adoption of emoji pictograms, which allow speakers to communicate without the need for language, means that in the future we will have no need for English or any other language. Now, I've used the winky face emoji here to indicate I'm just joking. But am I? After all, while there are over 1 billion uses of English in the world today, this number is positively dwarfed by the number of smartphone users who make regular use of emoji. But for emoji to become a fully fledged language in its own right, we would need a vastly greater number of characters. At present, the system remains too crude to represent all but the most straightforward concepts. This statement may appear to have been somewhat undermined by the team of translators who have successfully rendered Herman Melville's classic novel Moby Dick into emoji, or emoji Dick. But even the briefest glimpse at the resulting translation suggests that Melville's original has not been entirely replaced. So in Emoji Dick, the novel's famous opening sentence, "Call me Ishmael," is rendered somewhat cryptically by a series of icons showing a telephone, a man with a moustache, a boat, a whale, and an OK sign. Something has surely been lost in translation. It reassures me, at least, that words are surely here to stay, as are the fascinating stories that they tell. Thank you.
Thank Thank you so much, Simon. That was absolutely fascinating, really riveting listen. Now, we've got a Q&A function. If you look at the bottom of your screen, everybody, you'll see at the bottom in the middle, there is a Q&A button. And you can type questions into that, which I will then put to Simon, and he will answer them. We've had some questions that were put in advance, and we could start with some of those. But before we do, I just had a question. Listening to what you said about the invented words, and I don't know if this is another folk etymology or if it's true, but I was always told that the word quiz was the result of an 18th century bet to see if somebody could create a word that would become popular. Is that true, or is that a piece of folk etymology?
I think it's a piece of folk etymology, to be perfectly honest. But I don't actually know, so I'd have to check that one out. But it's too good a story. That's my suspicion about that one. But I'll have to look and see. I'm afraid I don't know.
Looking at some of the questions we had in advance, we've been asked a question about new words in 2020. This is from Stuart Rock. What new words have emerged in 2020, and which of them are most likely to stay with us?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting one. Of course, the Oxford dictionaries have just released their word of the year, which they do every year at this time. But this year, there are so many new words or words that have sort of defined the year that they had to go for more than one word of the year, which I think tells you something about it. But many, of course, of these are not necessarily new words. They're just words that have gained a lot of traction this year. And I suppose what really stands out is the way in which words that are really quite scientific, or in the field of epidemiology, have become sort of common parlance. So we all talk about herd immunity and understand it. We talk about the R number in a way that we would never have done 12 months ago. So I think those kinds of words have really dominated the discourse. But I mean, in terms of whether they're here to stay, I hope not. It'd be nice to think there's a future in which we don't all talk about the R number, or at least we leave it to the epidemiologists. So I think that's quite a defining feature of it. Of course, there are lots of words that sort of new portmanteaus, blend words that are particularly associated with coronavirus or with quarantining and so on, which again is a feature of the kind of explosion around language that's associated with this. And again, I suspect that these are all quite short-lived. They become fashionable and they die out.
One thing, of course, here we all are on a Zoom webinar. Now, Zoom, of course, a word that's been around for a long time, but certainly I hadn't heard it before this year in the context we're using it in tonight. And I think most people hadn't heard of this technology, but now if people say, shall I Zoom you? Everyone knows what you mean. And webinar is a word that's been around for a long time, but I think is a good example of a portmanteau word that we're using much more in 2020 than we ever thought we would. And maybe those words are here to stay, and it's not such a bad thing.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, I guess there are lots of discussions around the sort of potentially the positive outcomes of all of this is that the opportunity that it gives to have these kinds of events in a way that it'd be more difficult to do, have people coming in from all over. And so, yeah, I think those words around sort of WFH has the slightly cumbersome initialism, has it, because that takes a long time to say WFH, but work from home. Again, is part of that, isn't it? That all of that, the technology and all that's associated with it, and then all, of course, the Zoom bombing and all of the different formations that immediately come to mind from that.
We've also seen this year Trump trying to popularize the term China flu without a great deal of success.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting how even words like social distancing, which you think is very peculiarly associated with this pandemic, of course, goes back to the 1950s, was used by sociologists to talk about people who deliberately sort of create these very aloof persona. And even social isolation, again, is a late 19th century term around sort of the politics of particular states that decide to not to be cooperative with others. And so very often what you find with looking at the history of any word in particular is that it's generally a lot older than you think. What seems like very new vocabulary is often us sort of becoming more aware of it, or it going from more technical into more everyday usage.
Just looking at some of the questions that are being asked tonight, we've got a huge number of questions, I should say, so I don't think we're going to be able to get through all of them. So don't be sad if yours doesn't get asked. I've got now something like 26 questions, which I don't think we'll get through in 15 minutes. But what are some new words whose etymology is based on social media use? What has social media given us in terms of?
I guess, well, one of the things that drives social media very often is that it's about words that are short and quick. It tends to be high on abbreviations. Of course, initially it's very driven by the technology. So I think, initially we associated it with lots of, contractions, abbreviations, uses of the letter U, the number 2, and so on. But of course, that all now seems very old-fashioned, and it changes so quickly because it's partly about trying to communicate in real time quickly and on Twitter, particularly within a particular character limit. But it's also about trying to do it in a way that's sort of that is appropriate for the medium. So one of the things that you particularly associate with it is that flexibility. The rules of standard English are quite often don't apply. So it's partly about giving that sense of, this is immediate. I'm at the scene. I'm telling you exactly how it feels. I don't have time to go back and worry about how things should be spelt or whether I've punctuated it correctly. And so I think that's an area where what we're seeing is a lot of the rules of standard English being deliberately subverted. And so in some ways you could say what it's giving us is a kind of almost an alternative medium, and because language is sort of appropriate to medium, we've got a whole new language emerging in social media.
There's a question here from one of your former students, Megan Galbraith, now Megan Merton, from America. Happy Thanksgiving, Megan. She says, you mentioned that the American use of the word vest more closely reflects the word's original meaning. And I've heard this is often the case with American versus British usage. The American dialect has been more conservative. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks for that, Megan. You're absolutely right. So quite often in Britain, we tend to feel quite sort of, as if it's the English language, and therefore it's all about the British usage is sort of primary, and American usage often seen as a kind of corruption. But actually what very often happens is that older forms have been preserved in ways that they've then changed in the UK. So another example might be the word fall for what we would now call autumn, which is in fact an earlier use that was often used in Britain before it was taken to America, before autumn was used. So there's words like that. Other forms are things like the past participle of the verb to get, gotten, which is just an older form. We preserve it in ill-gotten gains, but it would have been the standard form of British English until, and it's been preserved in the US, or dove as the past tense of dive, like ride, rode, dive, dove. Again, these are sort of, if you want to think of older as being more correct, which I was sort of trying to suggest probably doesn't actually work, but those are the more archaic conservative forms, not later corruptions, which is how Brits often try to present them.
We've also got a question here from a Viking, a Norwegian, Fernley, who says, how much of modern English can be traced back to Norwegian Vikings?
Yeah, well, interestingly, quite a lot, because this is really going back to the Viking invasions of the 8th and 9th centuries, where because Old English and the Old Norse language, which is what was spoken by the Vikings at the time, which is the ancestor of the modern Scandinavian languages, because they are quite closely related. One's a North Germanic language and one is a West Germanic language. It promoted quite easy sharing between those. They're probably mutually understandable. And so quite a number of words were borrowed into English, particularly now they survive in the northern dialects of English, more so than they do in the standard language, which is based on the southern dialect. But they turn up in all kinds of everyday contexts. So things like terms for members of your family, the word sister is actually from the Norse form. Old English sveoster was the equivalent. Some parts of the body, the leg, is a word borrowed from Old Norse. And also things like grammatical words, which is very sort of striking, because of course we've got lots of French words that are borrowed into English, but they are kind of markedly less everyday, and they don't include grammatical items. So a good example of this are the pronouns they, their, and them, which are actually taken from the Old Norse language. They're not the Old English equivalents. So
would that suggest to you that the Vikings integrated more than the Normans did?
Yeah, that's right. So it tends to be that French words, because the Normans were more aristocratic and to sort of impose themselves upon British culture.
The sort of pork, pig, cow, beef.
Exactly, yeah, those kinds of distinctions. Whereas because the Vikings settled and intermarried and sort of assimilated more, there was the borrowing of vocabulary was in a more everyday way.
I'm very conscious of this up in the Lake District where we live, where Norse words are a part of everyday life. You know, you have the beck and you have the gill, and Esthwaite is the name of the valley, and you know those are all Norse words being used for features of the landscape, and the place names are almost all from the Old Norse.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, why does the letter, this is from David Gallup, why does the letter S in particular assume so many forms? And why in classical Greek does it differ according to its position in the word? This convention seems to have carried over into English printing, which uses both the S and the long form that looks like an F.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think that it's true to say that there are, in medieval handwriting, there are more variant forms of other letters as well. But it may be true that S does have a particularly large number. It's partly because there were a number of different script types for writing in the Middle Ages, because they were being introduced from different countries, different styles of script for writing different kinds of text. You know, this is in the pre-print era, where you had to have different ways of writing things depending on whether it was a Latin document that had a high status or whether it was a kind of a recipe book for use in the family and so on. And sometimes these different scripts sort of merged and blended so that a scribe might choose to adopt features from more than one source. And so you end up with a number of different letter forms that were available. And sometimes they are distinguished by position in the same way that is being described in classical Greek, so that the long S sometimes does get used in certain ways. But other times scribes, you know, they did what they wanted. They quite like the variability.
At least two people have asked about your own name, your quite unusual surname. One has asked, is it a portmanteau word? Any clues on etymology? Where does Horobin come from?
Yeah, well, it's not actually that strange or unusual, but people always seem to think it will be. And it's actually the Old English word har, which, like all Old English words with that long R sound, becomes an O. So it's hor is the modern word hor, as in grey. And then it's just the personal name Robin. So it's somebody called Robin who had grey hair, old Robin, which is nicer than what people always used to call me at school. And I wish I'd known it then, because it's too similar to horrible and bin. But grey Robin, I quite like.
Another question we've been asked is about words that soldiers have brought back from wars. Is this something that has happened particularly in slang, where people come back from war with different vocabulary and spread it back home?
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, and the First World War in particular, there's a lot of vocabulary that's associated with. It is particularly the trenches. I mean, I think that was important because there's lots of people. Dialect mixing is quite an important feature of language change. And of course, that was a time where people did mix in that way, and lots of new slang words were coined, or at least they were promoted. Again, sometimes they're older words that then just get revived. Even the word bumf, actually, which is there in the title of my book, have to get that in. But that word, the use of that word to mean bum fodder, as to mean toilet paper, is particularly associated with the First World War. But there are others like, flying ace. So someone who's good at something being an ace, it goes back to there. Or the gremlin, which was a term that they used in the RAF as a sort of make-believe sprite or goblin type figure who was sort of interfering with the workings in the aeroplane. That term goes back to then and was popularized, in fact, particularly in a book that Roald Dahl wrote, The Gremlins, one of his earliest works, because he was a World War I fighter ace. So yeah, there's lots of examples of that kind of thing. I think war, and as we're seeing with the pandemic, these big major world events quite often do have a lasting effect on the language.
This is an interesting question. This comes, hang on just one second. This comes from Ria Borgia. Teens change the definition of some words when they use them. For example, sick, now meaning great. What are some other examples, and have the new definitions found favour in the general public? And I'd like to add to that, is this an old trend, the idea of words being deliberately used in very different ways from their established meaning?
Yeah, I suppose, like for instance, wicked might be a slightly older fashioned version of the same thing, or bad. So it's not brand new in that sense. And again, it tends to be associated with a sort of youth culture around teenagers who are trying to sort of use words in. Again, it's the minute that people start noticing it and using it, particularly parents, that it changes again, because it then immediately loses its credibility. So this tends to be very quick changing usage. But the idea that a word can completely change its meaning to mean its opposite has a reasonably long history as well, a contronym. And there are a number of examples. It may seem kind of strange or almost sort of unhelpful for that to happen. But I mean, an example might be cleave or sanction, or dust, meaning to, you can dust for fingerprints when you put dust down, where you can take the dust off. Another one, of course, is literally, which is particularly associated with that demographic at the moment, where it's a word that really means, etymologically at least, means to the letter, precisely, exactly, is now being used widely to mean exactly the opposite, metaphorically. But
cleave meaning both to stick to and break apart. That's pretty old, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Why is it used? Why does it have those two opposite meanings? How does that happen? How far back does that happen?
Quite often what happens is these words, they tend to have technical meanings in certain contexts. So another example of that might be the word let, which means to allow something. But historically, there's another verb which now has ended up sounding precisely the same as that, which is the verb let, meaning to hinder or obstruct. And those two were in common use for a time, but it's just they fell together. They're different historically, but they fell together in sound. And as a consequence, the one that means a hindrance or an obstruction has only survived in certain sporting contexts. When the ball hits the net in tennis, you serve a let, or if someone gets in your way on the squash court, you can call a let. So they tend to then specialize so that you don't have two words meaning completely the opposite things in the same context, because that would be confusing.
And Monica Shah asks, is being published in the Oxford English Dictionary the way that words are deemed to be part of the British English language? Is the OED the arbiter of what is English?
Well, it's an interesting question, because if you asked one of the editors of the OED, they would say no, because that's not what they're doing. They're describing language use. But of course, that's precisely how many people view it. That
Well, certainly if they're playing Scrabble, you know.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to have, yeah, if you look it up in a dictionary, it's a real word. If it's not in the dictionary, it doesn't exist. But, you know, it's ironic because dictionaries are there to describe language use. But because people do use them in that way, that to some extent that does become a part of their function. And the OED, of course, in its strapline on the website that I showed you in the presentation, calls itself the definitive record of the English language, which rather does suggest that although they deny that role, they rather like to think of themselves in that way.
William Lawrence asks, are there examples of English words that have been adopted by other languages, changed by them, and then re-imported into English?
Yeah, that certainly does happen. So for instance, there are a number of words that borrowed from sort of Germanic generally, that were adopted into French and then borrowed into English. So words, you know, travel around in that way. And quite often the words that have come from the Middle East earlier on in the history of English have come via other European languages, so they get altered along the way. So it makes the job of the etymologist considerably more complicated, because of course they get changed as that happens. So there's always that process of sort of re-borrowing. And very often, I mean, in English, for instance, I mentioned the large number of words that come in from French, but many words, of course, come in later on in, say, the 16th century from Latin. But of course, French is ultimately derived from Latin, so they have a common source. And so sometimes a word might come from French, but the same word might also get borrowed in from Latin. And sometimes, of course, words are then changed in the 16th century in particular. French words might get respelt to make them look like they've come from Latin. And that's examples like debt and doubt, where we have a silent B, because the word was borrowed from French, dut or debt, but then respelt in the 16th century to make it look like it come directly from Latin. So again, these sort of complexities make it very difficult to decide in a way. So OED quite often will tell you that a word may have come from French, or it may have come from Latin, or may have come from both.
I'm going to ask you one last question, even though I know it's a question that you find irritating, which is a question from Mike Smith. Sorry, not from Mike Smith. It's from Alice Richardson, who says, what's your favorite word and why? You have a favorite word? Well, or a top three?
I don't know. I feel I should have one, shouldn't I? I mean, I was thinking about it just before, and one that stands out to me is not a very interesting etymology, but I quite like it because it just captures what the etymology is right there in front of you. And the word perfect, which is from the Latin per, meaning thoroughly or completely, and then fect is from the past participle of the verb facio, to do. So it just means perfectly made. And once you understand that, you understand what the word perfect means. So I like that one.
Well, thank you very much. That was a pretty perfect talk. So thank you. Thank you very, very much. It's been a fascinating evening. And we really appreciate you spending the time to give us that insight into the origins of words. So anyone who wants more of that, remember Simon's book, Bagels, Bumf and Buses, is available and would make a wonderful Christmas present for your sisters and other members of your family derived from Old Norse. Thank you all so much for joining us and for all of your questions. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get through all the questions in the time that we have available. I just want to draw your attention before we go to another Magdalen event that we are running before Christmas, which is on the 13th of December at 6 p.m. We are going to have our Carols by Candlelight service will be broadcast on Facebook and YouTube. So please do look out for that. That will come out to you in the mailing list notifications. So a very happy Thanksgiving to everybody in the US, and a very happy Thursday evening to everybody else. And all of our thanks to Simon and to Magdalen and Anna, who have so beautifully hosted and organized the webinar. Thank you all very, very much, and we hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.